Okay, if everyone's ready, we'll call this meeting of the Finance Committee, February 26th, to order. And our first presentation is the mid-year financial review.
So, good afternoon, Chair Dominguez, committee members. I am Jennifer Tomaszewski, and I am the Treasury Manager for the Finance Department. And with me here today is Mark Sewell, the Accounting Manager. And today we will be presenting the mid-year review for fiscal year 19. As part of that presentation, I'll start out going through the general fund revenues, focus on some of the larger variances at mid-year, and then I will hand it over to Mr. Sewell, who will go through the general fund expenditures, the enterprise funds, some of the highlights of the revenues and expenditures with those as well, and then he'll hit some of the highlights on the budget adjustments. So with that, I will start with the general fund revenues. So this first table, this is a summary of the total revenues for the general fund. We broke it into three categories. We have taxes, other revenues, and fees and service charges. The year-to-date budget, this is a three-year benchmark, which takes into account any seasonal trends. That's about $73 million at mid-year compared to actual, a little over $70 million, for a variance of about $2.8 million. Now, this is a little misleading in that there's some one-time revenues that we have not yet received. So even though it looks like we're below budget, we anticipate that we will have these by year end. Just quickly, oops, I'm sorry, I went a little too quick. So I did want to just point out that when we look at compared to last year, it's about 15% higher. Really what this is the impacts of Measure C, and we'll see this more on some of the upcoming slides. So this next slide is the detail for the tax revenues. So we have sales tax, Measure C, property tax, and so on. And we see that there's about a $266,000 deficit. I wanted to talk about sales tax and Measure C together because they're the same issues with a little caveat on Measure C, which I'll explain in a moment. So you may recall that back in fiscal year 18, the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration had implemented a new software, and with that there were some problems in processing several thousand tax returns, and most cities were impacted by that, and because of that we were about a little over $1 million short in both sales tax and Measure C at the end of 18. We've now received that money in 19, so that's where you see almost $1 million over in sales tax. On the Measure C, there was a little added caveat with the December payment, and the state accidentally sent us a check for $13 million instead of our $1.8 million. So rather than cashing that and having to repay it, we sent that money back to them, and it took a couple weeks longer to get our December payment. So if you include that in with the Measure C, the pattern's very similar to sales tax. And I just wanted to highlight with transient occupancy tax, it's tracking a little bit below budget by about $250,000. We're slightly over where we were last year at this point, but TOT is coming in pretty flat. So we're watching that, but it is flat. We believe that it could be the lingering impacts of the Thomas fire, but we'll just have to keep watching that to see what happens. So again, I just wanted to point out again the main cause for the large variance compared to last year is that last year at this time we had not begun collecting Measure C. So this next slide is other revenues. So we have licenses and permits, franchise fees, intergovernmental, and we ended at mid-year about $1.3 million below budget. This is broken into a few different categories. Fines and forfeitures is about a little less than $500,000 below budget. The main cause of this is parking violations. So, and when we look at compared to last year, we see those are down about 25%. And the main cause of this is difficulties staffing the parking enforcement. So with those vacancies, it just translates into fewer citations issued. Intergovernmental, the largest component to this is our mutual aid. We budgeted, the fire department budgeted about $1 million in mutual aid for fiscal year 19. At mid-year, we've received about $227,000 of that. However, we do anticipate that will be $1.6 million by year end. So we're anticipating the money, we just haven't received it yet, and that translates. You see, this number can sway significantly from year to year. It's not a steady check we get every month, so it really depends on the timing of when we receive that. Miscellaneous revenues are down about $469,000. This is This is going to be our operating transfers in, indirect costs, miscellaneous. A lot of these are based on one-time transfers. We haven't received those yet. So that's really it for other revenues. Lastly, I wanted to touch on some fees and service charges. So these are our departmental charges, and they're below budget at mid-year by about $1.2 million. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of those. So Public Works is down about $565,000. The majority of this relates to engineering work orders. There's been some vacancies in the engineering division. That translates into fewer engineers working on billable projects. So there are some salary savings that offset some of these costs, as there are with, I should have mentioned, with the parking violations as well, that there are salary savings that offset the reduced revenues. And then with the library, this I wanted to point out because it looks like it's 86% below where we were last year, but this is really, it relates to the per capita revenue that we received from the county. We received 2 biannual payments. Last year they had paid that in November. This year we didn't get it till January. So again, that's a timing issue. So that's really it for the general fund revenues. I just wanted to recap. We are at mid-year below $2.8 million, but we don't anticipate being below budget at year-end because of those one-time revenues and the prior year sales tax in Measure C.
So I have a question about slide 5, the property tax. So it looks like this year we're just barely ahead of last year. And is that because of something that Mr. Samario said at the budget workshop, where last year we had an unusual property tax revenue because of a one-time or some?
We had a few one-time payments. I don't recall quite what they were. There was $700,000 that we received for the RDA, and then there were some delinquent payments that we received. So those are not factored in. You're correct. And our budgeted in our growth assumption was about 5.5% growth, and we are tracking pretty close to budget right now.
Okay. And I know property tax has been a stalwart the last few years, whereas sales tax and TOT has been a little more variable.
Correct.
So I just wanted to make sure that's why that hasn't increased a lot over last year. It's just that last year was a better year than we
That's
expected.
correct.
Thank you.
So with that, I will hand it over to Mr. Sewell.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Tomaszewski. So I'm Mark Sewell, I'm the accounting manager. I'll be discussing the general fund expenditures, and then I'll be moving into the enterprise funds, revenues and expenditures, and then be highlighting some of the budget adjustments we are proposing today. So the general fund expenditures, this table is a little busy, but these do represent all the departments within the general fund, with the annual budget of $161 million. And what I'll say to you is, in echoing some of the comments made by Ms. Tomaszewski about some of the revenues that you heard, which are slightly below budget, we do have the majority of our departments here showing savings, primarily driven by salary and benefits and vacancies. And so, of course, where there are fewer people citing parking violations or fewer engineers working on capital jobs, you obviously have a saving, but you do have that revenue impact. But what I have done is highlighted a couple of departments here that I wanted to just pull out because they are not really in the same trend. And the fire department here, halfway down the screen, at mid-year is reporting a costs of just under $500,000 more than the 3-year average budget. That isn't really anything to be too concerned with because that is just the impact of the mutual aid costs. So where we are projecting more revenue, clearly we've had some more costs associated with the responses to other emergencies. And then I wanted to also pull out for you the non-departmental variance here. Again, the way that we tried to look at our performance at mid-year is comparing it to the budget based on over the last 3 years how much had typically been spent, and then apply that to the budget. And it's a good idea to do that, but sometimes it throws up a few curious results, and this one is the main one, the $1.5 million. And this is just because this is where we account for the transfer out of the Measure C tax revenue. So it's received as revenue, and then it's transferred into a specific capital fund. And so that's why that's a lot higher. And within that number as well is a one-time $3 million loan from the general fund to the airport fund, which occurred in the first half of the year. And so that kind of explains the 1.5 million and explains why it's such a large number there as an expense of non-departmental. Okay.
Question. And that third department, it's a small variance, but that's a department that might want to be leading. Is there any explanation for what's happening there?
That, I believe, Chair Dominguez is referring to the Mayor and Council. Mm-hmm. That $30,000 is pretty much mostly to do with the timing of when things are spent in the year, not necessarily an expectation of whether the department is going to be ending the year over or under budget. I have, in speaking with the staff responsible for looking at those budgets, had confirmation that they expect that budget to end the year under budget.
Good answer. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the enterprise funds. So on these charts, there's two tables, and they show you all of the major enterprise funds. And they show the revenues and the expenses, because, of course, the enterprise funds are responsible for generating revenues to cover their expenses. And I just wanted to pull out a couple of the ones on this first slide and explain what's going on. So you can see here the solid waste fund. The revenues are slightly behind where we would have expected them to be based on the budget at mid-year, and they have savings which are in excess of that. So in essence, the fund is actually doing better from a financial standpoint at mid-year when you look at the revenues and expenses. And that's primarily to do with the assumptions in the budget, where I think the revenue was projected too high. And because it's a pass-through agreement, if the revenues are lower, then so are the expenses. And so if the activity in that fund is higher or lower than budget, then what you tend to see is the revenues and the expenditures moving in sync with each other. And so the net of that at mid-year is that the fund is actually in a better financial position by $473,000. The water fund, you can see here that the revenues are, again, slightly higher, with the expenses coming in slightly lower, and that's just to do with the volume of water that people are using, of course, and with the most recent rains, hopefully we'll see that the amount of water people will be using will still continue with the expectation of budget. And I think the staff in the water fund are confident that they'll end the fiscal year with very minor variances in terms of both revenues and expenditures this fiscal year. And then I wanted to pull out the airport fund, which is doing very well this fiscal year. There's been a lot of good news recently with regards to some new carriers which are coming in there. And we're seeing that as a result come into some of their revenues that they're seeing at mid-year. And we're also seeing the impact here of the refinancing of the airport bonds, which is reducing the debt payments that are required to service those bonds in the airport department. So we're seeing that fund is in a more favourable position.
Before you move into budget adjustments, I just wanted to ask about the solid waste fund. Do you know what category the deviance in the revenues is? Is that from tipping fee collection? Is that from the hauling itself, or organics, recycling?
I'm looking at Mr. Samario. I think he'd have the best answer to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Finance Director. So the variance we're seeing in solid waste, the unfavorable variance is, as Mark indicated, I think when in hindsight we probably established a budget that was too high, and when you look at how the year ended last year. But those revenues just come from rates. So it's ratepayers that cover both the collection costs, which are really the pass-through that Mark referred to, that was paid to Marburg, the tipping fees that are paid to the county, and then for our own programs. But it's all through the rates we charge our customers that they get allocated to those various purposes. Again, it's just really a matter that our revenue budget was too high, but because our revenue budget was too high, then our expenditure budget was too high, and that's where we're seeing a corresponding savings because the money that we're passing on to Marburg or to the county for tipping fees are less than what we thought.
So it wasn't from any one category. Again, we've talked a lot about the recycling market disappearing, and we've talked about tipping fees. And it seems like this is a department where most of the fees are predicted. They're not volumetric. So people reduce waste. You're not going to see it show up in their bill because they're paying for one size canister.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think it's really that the amount of money that we expected to collect and be passing on to Marburg for collection, that's probably where most of that variance is coming from. Not in our own programs. Our programs are pretty well balanced. We understood those. It's some of the variability comes from the collection rates, levels of service that people have and they're at the curb and all that in terms of carts and cans. So again, I think where our budget was too high was on how much we expected to collect on the rates for the payments to Marburg. So that's where we're seeing a corresponding shortfall in both.
Okay. And if you do see anything as you look at this in the budget process, please feel free to bring it up when this comes back at the
Will do.
council. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to some proposed budget adjustments. This is just a highlight of some of those which are listed into your attachment 3. So I wanted to start with the general fund and just share with you that this first adjustment uses some salary and benefit savings within the fire department to transfer $12,000 to the IT fund in this fiscal year for the funding of a new part-time IT specialist that will be dedicated to the fire department to help them with their needs. In addition, so the fire department is also working on some improvements to the fire station alert system, and working closely with the IT department, they've identified some additional needs for that project, which come to the cost of $55,000. And so this adjustment decreases the appropriations for salary and benefits again within the fire department and transfers $55,349 to Measure C fund to complete that project. I wanted to include this slide in here. This was unfortunately missed from the attachment 3, but I wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to look at it. The other entries are included in the attachment, but this one is required to make sure that we get the approval to appropriate the funds into the general fund for $107,251 for the use of in the Hilda Ray McIntyre Park for improvement projects. And this money has been earned over a number of years when the caretaker house located within that park was rented, and that rental income was to be used for future park improvements, and so therefore this adjustment would enable the Parks and Recreation Department to program those capital funds. And then the one before you here on slide 4 of the 8 budget adjustments is a $5 million transfer out from the general fund contingency reserves to produce more funding for the Cabrillo Pavilion renovation project. The construction is obviously ongoing, as we're all aware. We can see that the building is still under construction and anticipated to be completed this calendar year. And I believe Council heard an update from staff last year whereby there was a discussion around how some of the difference between what was already appropriated for that construction contract and what was needed for that construction contract, how that could potentially work. And so this adjustment here appropriates $5 million of general fund contingency reserves to be used for that project, to be paid back over 5 years by the Measure C fund. And so here you get to see the capital outlay side of that, whereby you get the $5 million in the capital outlay fund to spend on the project. And you also see the $107,000 for the Parks and Recreation Department to be able to spend in Hilda Ray Park. And then 6 of 8, wanted to share that there's a request to transfer monies from the Airport Passenger Facility Charge Fund of $3 million to the Debt Service Fund. And this is required to be able to transact for the new bond issue that was recently raised, which actually saves the airport department a considerable amount of money on the debt financing costs. And so there's the $3 million transfers. And then we have another interfund proposal here whereby a fuel side upgrade was completed, and that was completed with the aid of a loan between the Fleet Replacement Fund and the Fleet Maintenance Fund. And so these adjustments enable the repayment of the portion of the loan that was not required, and also the transfer of the cash to the fund, which actually paid the costs for that fuel site upgrade, which I think was about $600,000 in the end. And then finally, this is a request to reduce the appropriations from the Airport Industrial Specific Area Plan Update Capital Project Code of $35,000 to move into the airline terminal apron redesign project. This request is coming because the combined transfer of capital was over $35,000, therefore requires council action. And this is to assist with the project to build a bridge at Gate 3. The full cost of that is expected to be around $800,000, and staff are requesting a grant and are confident that that grant will be successful. And this enables them to get ahead of that in terms of the design to make that grant application possible. And so with that, we're looking for a recommendation for the that you accept the fiscal year 19 interim financial statement for the 6 months ended December 31st, and to approve the proposed mid-year adjustments for fiscal year 19 appropriations and estimated revenues as detailed in the presentation and the attached schedule of proposed mid-year adjustments.
Any questions from my colleagues? Mr. Friedman?
And I'm just prepared to move the staff recommendation.
Let me ask first, are there any public comments? There's no speaker slips. There's a lot of people in the audience, but no public comment. So motion by Mr. Friedman.
Second. And thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now on the agenda is the home tenant-based rental assistance grants.
How dare them leave?
Thank you, Ms. Stotts. Whenever you're ready, now that the room's quieting.
Good afternoon. My name is Liz Stotts. I'm the Senior Community Development Program Specialist for Community Development Department. I'm here to talk about the tenant-based rental assistance grants that we are recommending today for approval. So we have, the city has approximately $732,000 in federal home funds. The eligible uses are property acquisition, new construction, rehabilitation, and tenant-based rental assistance, which is what we'll be talking about today. The Tenant-Based Rental Assistance Program, or TBRA, provides rental assistance to low-income households who are homeless or at imminent risk of becoming homeless to help them afford market-rate units. Assistance can be provided as a monthly rental voucher or as one-time utility and or security deposit assistance payments, depending on the household's need. Rental assistance can be provided for up to 24 months. With the TBRA program, the rent is paid directly to the landlord. The tenant pays 30% of their up to 30% of their monthly income, and the TBRA subsidy covers the difference. To allocate these home funds, staff issued a notice of funding availability in June of 2018. By the deadline, 3 applications were received, and they were evaluated by the following criteria: the target population to be served, the experience and the expertise of the applicant, and the types of support services that would be provided in addition to the rental assistance. The recommended grants are $300,000 to New Beginnings Counseling Center, $165,000 to Transition House, $265,000 to the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Barbara. All 3 organizations currently operate city-funded TBRA programs. Each of the proposed TBRA programs conform to the guidelines established by HUD for operation of TBRA programs. and they meet the city's strategic plan for providing decent, affordable housing to low-income households, as identified in the city's 5-year consolidated plan and annual action plan. I'll go over each organization and what they propose to do. New Beginnings is recommended for $300,000. Their target population is homeless individuals out living on the streets, homeless persons living in their cars, and veterans. They have operated their TBRA program since 2017 and have provided housing assistance to 39 households. With this grant, the new grant, they expect to serve approximately 50 new households. And if approved today, this grant would extend their current existing grant until October of 2022. In addition to rental assistance, New Beginnings would be providing the tenants with case management, job training, crisis intervention, and counseling programs. Transition House is being recommended for $165,000. Their target population is homeless families or those that are at imminent risk of becoming homeless. They have received a TBRA grant from the city since 2012 and to date have served 100 households. With this new grant, they expect to serve 35 new households. And this would also be an extension of their current grant, and it would be extended till October of 2022. Transition House proposes to also provide a minimum of 6 months of case management to each of their tenants, where they could go over household finances, help them with accessing entitlements or other community resources, and provide career development and life skills education. The third recommended applicant is the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Barbara, and they're recommended for $265,000. Their target population are homeless individuals and families that are on Section 8 waiting list. Since 2012, they have received TBRA grants from the city and have served 112 households. With this new grant, they propose to serve 60 new households, and this would be a new grant, and it would expire also in October 2022. The Housing Authority proposes to provide supportive services that they make available to all their tenants with case management, job skills assessment, and independent living skills. And that is my presentation. I'll go over the staff recommendations. We recommend that the Finance Committee allocate $300,000 of existing appropriations to New Beginnings Counseling Center and extend their existing grant term to expire in October 2022. Allocate $165,000 of existing home program appropriations to Transition House and extend their existing grant term to expire in October 2022. To allocate $156,952 of existing appropriations in the Home Fund and increase appropriations by $108,048 from Home Fund reserves for a total of $265,000 for a new 3-year grant agreement to the Housing Authority to expire in 2022, and to authorize the Community Development Director to execute agreements and related documents. And that is my presentation.
Any questions?
I do have a question. So can you help me understand why it's $127,000 in reserves, and how do those reserves get repaid?
These are HUD grants, so this is money that we already have in hand. They just haven't been appropriated.
So it's not, it's the grant, it has to go out because it's a grant, so it's not like a typical reserve that we would see on a normal budget, correct?
Am I understanding the question correctly? Then,
Mr. Chair, committee members, when the grants come in, they don't always get spent in the same year. So at the end of the year, they just fall into reserves. And like you indicated, it's not the reserves we typically see in terms of operations. These are just monies reserved for specific purposes created from these grant funds that are unspent, and they get appropriated in subsequent years.
Oh, so it's more like a carryover.
Yes,
in
exactly.
reserve.
It's
Okay,
great
I
to
just
look
want,
at it.
because I saw the term reserves, and I thought we had certain reserves, like we,
Yep.
you know, the 10 and 15% we have, and we're spending from reserves. Okay,
Yes.
I understand now. Thank you.
thank you, Bob.
Madam Mayor, any questions?
I don't have questions. I'm just very excited. This is like good news for everybody. And we work so hard trying to help people who are homeless or on the edge or sleeping on couches or in their cars. And here's some money that we are giving to really good organizations. Of course, Mr. Chair, know the good work of Transition House, the Housing Authority, and New Beginnings. And I see that there's some measures in place. The income is reviewed annually to make sure. I mean, we want people to make more money and be more prosperous and help themselves. But I see everything seems to be in place to use this money wisely, and I really trust these organizations. So I'm in support of the recommendation to fund these programs.
You're absolutely right. These are three amazing organizations that we're really proud to have in Santa Barbara. My question is on the slide 5 where you talk about the evaluation criteria. Do you look at outcomes and do you measure their outcomes like you do when you're looking at CDBG grants for other nonprofits?
They are required to report to us the number of tenants that are housed, and I believe the Housing Authority and other organizations do keep track of their who gets placed into permanent housing, but they report to us the basics, the demographics, the income.
And I notice in the slides you talk about 50 new households estimated, 35 new households estimated, 60. And what are you measuring that against? Is there a HUD formula, or is there just kind of what you've seen in the past? How do these numbers make sense to us?
Yeah, Committee Chair Dominguez, they are estimates by the organization, and they are all of them are provided to us with the caveat that these are really estimates because it depends on the household that comes in and the apartment that they find and how much rental assistance they need and how much that apartment costs. So there are various factors to consider. So there are estimates, best estimates that they can determine.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
I'll make a motion if I may.
Let me just check. No public comment? No speaker slips? Okay.
Thank you. I move that we recommend to the City Council to make these allocations to appropriate the funds from the Home Reserve funds to the housing grants and to authorize funding agreements to be executed.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That's unanimous. Motion passes. Thank you very much.
Good work.
Seeing no other public comment to any items not on the agenda, I'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everyone.